I've got a complex matter that I want to try and present as straight and as open as I can. My fear is that I'll be seen as either bending one way or another, but I don't want to. I want to call it straight. Let's get going. There's some of you may remember some of the hymns of the past. Do you remember, for example, "All to Jesus I surrender, all to Him I freely give"? Yeah. What about "Have Thine own way, Lord, have Thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Mould me and make me after Thy will. While I am waiting, yielded and still." Anyone remember that one? Yeah, I thought so. I still really love those words. But you know something? From the perspective of this stage of life, I can see that perhaps they could lead to a passivity for a believer that in the long term can be harmful. Do we have slide 2, please? I hope today you can stand with me a short distance away from such language and see that it reflects a particular language and Christian culture that has a defined historical root. So my question that I'm asking you today goes back to those exciting car trips with Paul Mercer when we discussed everything, and especially theology. How much does our theology derive from those historical and cultural roots? Where is true? Next slide. I'm going to look at this through 3 prisms. Try to break down and see what makes up the light that we have. The first is the story of Hudson Taylor. The story of my parents, Norman John Chenoweth, and then I'm going to come back to my own story. In some ways, Hudson Taylor represents a faith path of sacrifice and following Jesus without counting the cost, and that powered generations of evangelicals. My parents' story shows how it worked in practice, and my own story opens the perspective that there was that cultural aspect to that way of faith that exists still today, and that from there a slide into error is all too easy. Next slide. Each of the Theology on Tap seminars, as you've heard, examines some well-known Christian life, and today my task is Hudson Taylor. Is there anyone who's heard of Hudson Taylor? Yeah, I thought I might be amongst HT. I'm going to call him HT. He is one of the world's best recognised missionaries. This description sums him up by an archbishop. He was a man of total devotion to Christ and the missionary cause, a man of ecumenical spirit, a man of originality in initiating new attitudes to mission, a doctor, a translator, an evangelist, a heroic figure of the church. Tick, tick, tick. He wrote to his sister Amelia, "If I had £1,000, China would have it. If I had 1,000 lives, China would have them. No, not for China, but Christ." Can we do too much for him? And finally, another typical phrase for which he's well known, and indeed it featured in our book. China is not to be won for Christ by quiet, ease-loving men and women. The stamp of men and women we need is such as will put Jesus, China, souls first and foremost in everything and at every time. Even life itself must be secondary. So let's have a look, next slide please, at James Hudson Taylor. He was born on the 21st of May 1832 to a Christian family in the Yorkshire town of Barnsley. His dad was a pharmacist, and H.T. was then born again in 1849 at the age of 17. Later that same year, in December, he reached a fresh point of dedication of himself to God. And he said to God he would go anywhere that God wanted him to go. And he describes an awful sense of the divine presence that came upon him as he could not describe. He felt the offering was accepted, and as distinctly as if a voice had uttered it, "Then go to China," was spoken to his soul. And from that hour, his mind was made up. He landed in Shanghai in 1854, aged 22. 11 years of hardship later, he formed a mission. He knew that one man's efforts were never going to reach all those souls who were perishing in China without ever hearing about Jesus. And so he formed the China Inland Mission in 1865, and there's a great story about that I haven't time to open. But within 20 years, there were 188 CIM, China Inland Mission, missionaries, and by 1934, there were 1,368 missionaries in China. In 1890, an Australian branch was opened. He had a very interdenominational and international viewpoint. And within 10 years, there were 101 missionaries from Australia in China. 15 nations contributed missionaries by 1890. Next slide, please. Hudson Taylor enumerated a number of principles, and I've pinched some of them for today. Neither Hudson Taylor nor the CIM ever solicited funds. I've fallen into the habit of calling it a faith mission, but H.T. objected to that term because it implies that he had a special faith. He said, "No, I have a special God." So that where there was a financial need, the missionaries, and Hudson himself had lived this way, were not allowed to make public or tell people of their need. They told God. And once they had his sense of leading, they went ahead and waited for the money to come. In 1887, the CIM had reached 265 missionaries, and H.T., while in the UK, felt that God was saying, call for another 100 missionaries. And he knew that that was implying that their revenue at that time of £20,000 sterling annually would have to increase to £40,000 sterling. But he had a strong sense that God wanted him to do it. And so he went ahead, and it was raised. The mission followed that protocol for 100 years and never went into debt, although there were some times when they didn't pay their missionaries. And they said, down to you guys now, pray it in. As a missionary's kid, my only comment would be that somehow relying on God never seemed to get much past the basic standard of living. One summary I read impressed me. The CIM was a large organisation being run on funds promised by God, but without a human guarantee of any kind. Now, the principle was the one of unanimity amongst the directors. These were guys with pretty strong opinions, but they had a respect for each other's views and a willingness to accept them under the influence of the Holy Spirit. So if they reached an argument or an impasse, the meeting was stopped, and the next 24 hours was spent in prayer together until they reached unanimity. H.T. showed a sincere admission of everything to God, a submission of everything to God, and his conviction was that God would direct his steps. And at the end of his life, he looked back and said, God has done that for me. He was an exponent of simplicity and Chinese dress. At a time when missionaries were living in white enclaves, he lived in Chinese homes, had a queue, a pigtail, and CIM missionaries followed him. Unreluctant adaptation of national life won Chinese approval. And the other two you can read. Through the 1890s, intermittent riots broke out in parts of China. And in many ways, as I've been reading this, reflecting on the relationship between China and the West now, the same pressures are still there. There was a term that the Chinese had then, that foreign powers were slicing the sausage of China one cut at a time. Japan took Manchuria, Russia took this. Bits and pieces were being lost to the country. And there was discomfort. No CIM missionary was killed until 1898, but 15 had died from disease in that time. So it was not a safe occupation. HT's response was to encourage missionaries, quote, to remain at one's post. Another quote, rely on the living God alone for protection. And another quote, a holy joy in God is far better than a revolver. HT died in 1905. Next slide, please. And his last years were difficult. In 1900, the Boxer Rebellion broke out in China. It was anti-foreigners, and it was initiated by a severe drought, particularly in the northeastern provinces. The rebels believed that gods required the blood of sacrificed foreigners for them to be appeased. By then, there were 85,000 registered Christians in China. Many Chinese Christians were slain, as well as 58 missionaries of the CIM, with 21 of their children, and a further 8 children were orphaned. The Western powers swept in, crushed the rebellion, punished China, extorted quite heavy reparations. The CIM chose not to follow that path. They declined all offers for compensation. 3 years later, 15 border boys, Hudson had set up a school at a place called Chifu, and 15 boys died one weekend from cholera, food poisoning. They never knew. So was the sacrifice worth it? It's been notoriously difficult to count the Christians in China for reasons that I'm sure many of you will be aware of. I think everyone agrees there are more Christians in China now than there are in France. Official government figures report 44 million baptised Protestant Christians by 2018. The Pew Research Centre estimates that a more accurate figure is 116 million by 2020. Next slide, please. So I draw some conclusions here. God has blessed his church greatly in China. But the Chinese church is built on the blood of martyrs and the sacrificed deaths of children. That I'm coming back to. One more quote from Hudson Taylor about long separations from his wife Jeannie, the second wife. He said to her, God has given us a costly sacrifice to offer to him. an alabaster box to lay at his feet. So through this first prison, the Hudson Taylor prison, I see, and I think you may well be with me in this, a strong culture of cost and sacrifice in following God. Next slide, please. I move now to the story of my parents, Norm Chenoweth and Joan Brooks, who married in Shanghai in 1950. How did that Christian way of sacrificial life affect their lives? Norm came from a broken family, and he was sent to BBC as a boarder from grade 1. It was just there during the week, and then he went home at weekends. He was saved. He had quite a dramatic conversion experience to meet Jesus when he was in grade 12. And he straight away became a very active evangelist, soul winner. Interesting side comment is that the speaker at the meeting where he was converted was Joby L.P. Peterson's uncle. It's a small world. Yeah. The thing that really spoke to him was when he heard that following Jesus would bring blessings on his life, his family, his children, and to his children's children. Children were important to him. After the war, Dad had graduated as a doctor, and he felt God call him to go to China with the China Inland Mission. And so he joined the next group of CIM applicants at their course in Melbourne. Joan Brooks grew up in a Baptist family with what we would now call fundamentalist beliefs. During World War II, she was working in some government department, and she felt that God was calling her to go to Melbourne Bible Institute. The next day, she received a donation from someone who didn't know her of the sum of the first term's enrolment fees. And so she went down and completed her course in MBI, and then felt God calling her to go to China. Now, preparing for this talk has just made me aware of how acutely they must have known that it was only 40 years before that so many missionaries had been killed. This was not a light-hearted decision. Now, Joan and Norm met in Melbourne at the candidates course and became engaged. They sailed to Shanghai in 1948 for their study of Mandarin for the next 2 years, and during that time, the Communist Party took over most of China. Mum and Dad were bombed on several occasions. Mum described in a letter the foggy morning of the 5th of June 1949 when she looked out of the window to see the Communist army moving in and taking over Shanghai. She just says that they were much better disciplined than the Nationalist army. And the CIM's response? No change. We stay put. We're here to preach Jesus. At the end of their time of language study, the mission directors conferred together as to where they felt Norm and Joan would be best used, Dad with his medical skills. And they came to Mum and Dad and said, look, we believe that God is leading us to send you to a hospital up in the centre of China. And Dad went away and prayed about it. And he came back to the directors and said, I'm hearing the verse from God, return to the land of your fathers. And the director said, no, you're not. If that's the case, then we've all got to leave. Go and pray some more. And he came back and said, look, I'm hearing the same thing from God, but I'm under your authority. If you tell me to go, I'll go. And the director said, no, if you're hearing from God, obey. So they got on a ship, went down through a typhoon. Mum shared a cabin on the ship on the way to Hong Kong with 4 nuns who'd been brutalised in Mongolia before they were expelled, forced to run naked through the streets. So they were damaged. They arrived in Hong Kong, and do you know who was there? The staff of the hospital that Dad had been sent to. The local Communist Party representatives had expelled the missionaries, even while Dad was debating whether to go there. My family took from that my dad had heard God rightly. And indeed, the whole mission was expelled in the next 6 months. So, back in Brisbane, Dad set up a general practice in Racecourse Road in Ascot. And after some delay, Mum fell pregnant. But then the baby was freshly stillborn. And this was, of course, a searing and scarring tragedy for them. Dad promised God that if he gave them a child to keep, they would return to the mission field. That child was me, born in 1953. I found another story about their birth. I'm building a picture of the sort of faith that my parents had, so stay with me. But I found a story about my birth in their papers in recent years. The doctors looking after Mum advised her that she should be delivered by caesarean section because of the risk of a repeat stillbirth. But Dad believed God had spoken to him, saying, if you go for a natural delivery, it'll be okay. But if you go for a Caesar, things won't go well. Dad wrote, and I've seen his words, I knew my stand could end up with the death of a second child, but I rolled the responsibility onto my Lord, and we waited. At 42 weeks, 2 weeks late, I arrived, safely, naturally. Dad's faith was again justified. But as an obstetrician, I have to say that I would hate to have had that sort of family coming to me. It's a really difficult dad. My sister was born 2 years later, and Dad wanted confirmation that God was indeed leading them back into mission work. So he put out, like Gideon, a fleece. He asked the Lord to give him 15 souls saved, while preparations went ahead for work in Thailand with the successor mission to the CIM, the Overseas Missionary Fellowship. And you know what? 17 people became Christians through Dad. To my astonishment, and I do think this was God's goodness to me, in 2019, I was at a group of men, and one of them came, we fell into conversation, and his name was Wayne, and he knew this story of the 17. His mother's sister was one of the 17. Dad had led her to the Lord in his surgery, and then on a home visit, he led her son to the Lord when he dropped in to give him a vaccination. I said he preached in and out of season. And Wayne said to me that the wonderful thing is that the whole family had followed and become Christians, and their family was continuing strong in faith to this day today. That came at a hard time in the journey I'm about to open for you. I felt arms around me. Next slide, please. So in Prism 2, the conclusions I would reach that Joan was passionate to serve Jesus in saving Chinese at any cost. And I see that my dad, to our family, was a man of God who had God's ear and who heard God speaking to him. I move now to my own story. I'll stay with that slide for a moment, I think. Yep. First, I will tell you the tale I lived with. We all have a life story. I'm going to share you the life story that I grew up with. Then I'll show you how that fell apart. We four set sail for Thailand in late 1957. I was 4 years old. We landed in Bangkok on a Friday, and on Monday, Mum and Dad went to start language school. We were left with a babysitter who was Thai, actually Muslim as it turned out, couldn't speak any English, and off they went. We spent nearly 12 months living in that single room while Mum and Dad studied Thai full time. And then we were posted to central Thailand. Next slide, please. Right from the start, I was told that I was going to be sent to the mission boarding school 1,500 kilometres away in the tropical jungle of the Cameron Highlands of Malaya. This was named after the school in China that I've already mentioned. I was told how good it would be to have friends to play with every day, that the Thai heat and humidity, which was oppressive, would be replaced by cool mountain air 5,000 feet up in one of the world's beautiful places, and it was. The frequent illnesses of Thailand would be less in such a setting. I was often told the tale of Hannah, who after infertility fell pregnant and delivered the prophet Samuel. And she gave him back to the priestly school at a young age when she'd weaned him as a thank you to God. I was told I was a Hannah's child. But the main reason for sending me away, I was told, was relatively simple. God required it as an act of sacrifice. Could my parents hold back when God had given his only son, Jesus, to be crucified for the sins of the world? Jesus himself has said, "He that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. He that loseth his life for my sake shall find it." It's getting a bit complicated, isn't it? Abraham had received accolades through generations because when God asked him, Abraham put his longed-for son Isaac, the promised son after infertility, onto an altar and prepared to slay him as a sacrifice. But God, satisfied, provided a substitute, and Isaac was spared. The altar on which the sacrifice was to occur was named Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. And that had become the CIM-OMF mission motto. I was an Isaac. Dad was convinced that in sending me to Chifu, he was blessing me and our family. The faithful God he knew would honour their sacrifice of me and our family life. Jehovah Jireh was a promise to Mum and Dad. God himself would watch over me, my sister, my brother, as we went there and keep us from harm. The day came for me to leave. Our family, joined by my brand new brother Neil, born 2 weeks before, we travelled down to Bangkok, where I joined a small group of other students on a 3-day train trip down the Malay Peninsula. On the second night, a teacher wrote later, I cried. The teacher said that I apologised the next morning, saying, I don't know why I cried. I must have been really tired. Do any of you have 5-year-old children or grandchildren? I don't think they would say that, but I did. After a second Malayan train trip, we detrained, caught taxis up the Cameron Highlands. 500 bends the road includes, and it was famous amongst we children because every one of us vomited every single time we went up and every single time we went down. Then I arrived. I was at Chifu. Within the first few weeks, it all caught up with me. Feeling utterly alone, I just knew something had gone wrong. This wasn't right. I needed to get back to my parents. So I got my cardigan, wrapped it around me, got a water bottle, and I walked down the crunching driveway towards the school stone gates. And I got to the gates and I looked around, and there was dense green jungle. There was this loud sound of cicadas. There was bird song. There was the distant chattering of gibbons. And I'd already heard stories about armed rebels from the Malayan emergency. There'd been gunfights not far away from where we were. And of course, there were lots of stories of snakes. We'd already seen them at the school. And there were stories of tigers in the surrounding area. So I curled up outside that pillar and wept. I've never felt so truly alone. And slowly my strong determination to return to my family leaked away. And 2 hours later, I trickled back defeated to anxious teachers and the boarding school. One of the lovely things is that in some part of the story I'll come to later, one of the boys that was at the school at that time confirms the details that I've just told you. 5-year-old memories, well, it was probably 6 by then. You know, how reliable are they? Pretty good. Okay, can we have slide 12? Oh, the next one. Sorry, come back up. Can we go backwards? 2 back? No, sorry. This way. That's it. Okay. So that's the picture of Brother Neil, me, and my sister. And that was taken just as I was about to leave. And the next picture is all dressed, ready to go. And the next picture is the front gates of the school. That's not actually quite the gates that I ran away at, but I didn't have a good picture of that. You know, the school moved. Looking back, I see I had learned a new skill that day. I put away the pain and determined to just soldier on. Sadness and crying were put there too. I don't remember ever being so upset again. I had formed my first internal walled compartment. As it turned out, that was quite helpful to have something like that. Doctors have a problem with the stuff that they have to cope with. I didn't. And kids adapt. And I did. From that place, I made my life. Chifu gave me a good education. And as I entered grade 6 in 1964, I was put alone onto a BOAC plane and flown home to Brisbane. The mission policy was that at the end of grade 6, you went back to your home country. And I spent the next 18 months living with my grandmother and her sister and my mother's sister. My parents returned in 1966 on furlough, and when they saw that this process was affecting both Robin and myself, they resigned from the mission. And so my life flowed on into an Australian pattern. I completed medical studies, married Wendy, specialised in obstetrics and gynecology and set up in private practice. Subsequently, I subspecialised in infertility medicine and ended up as the medical director of the Monash IVF unit at the Wesley Hospital. We had 4 lovely children. I remained a keen Christian of the Baptist brand and was involved in church work for most of those years. I rarely thought about my chief in childhood. Indeed, I could barely remember it. If asked, and I was asked intermittently, I said, look, some kids may have had problems, but gave me resilience. Gee, I've heard people say that since then about other things, and it always makes me question it. Because I was about to get a very big surprise. In 2014, I received a letter from the OMF. They apologised for sending us to Chifu. These words: while there are some who found their experiences nurturing and positive, there are others for whom such policies resulted in feelings of alienation, rejection and pain. We ask for forgiveness of all who suffered. We want to open the doors of reconciliation and forgiveness. I was surprised by the letter, but unaffected, until I tried to read it to my family at Sunday lunch and burst into tears. Something's wrong. I decided to go into Chifu to the reunion that the OMF was organising and largely funding. And it was in the grounds of the most recent Chifu school, one that we just saw before, in the Cameron Highlands. It's now a Methodist conference centre. I asked, when did you come? I said, look, we'll go to this conference. We'll do, you know, the thing that you do at conferences. You attend the first session and then you kind of just disappear. And I'll show you the beautiful Cameron Highlands. And I'm so glad she came. The first night there, Ulrika Ernvik, a counsellor and speaker, played a game with us. We had a hall bigger than this. And she said, right, that's England, that's USA, that's Canada, that's Australia, that's New Zealand, that's Sweden, that's Germany, that's Switzerland, that's Thailand, Malaya, Indonesia, Philippines, Korea. And so every country that was involved in the mission had an area of the room. And then she started in 1950 and said, where were you in 1950? Go to the country where you spent most of that year. The room became a mass of moving ex-Chifu students. It was remarkable. For our childhood, there was no geographical stability, no opportunity to retain friends. We went from one culture to another with astonishing speed. Families were transitory. Furloughs appeared random to us children. Friends ephemeral. And cultures a bewildering melange. The next day, Ruth Van Rieken took up the podium. It wasn't really a podium. Sounds good though, doesn't it? And she presented her work. Now, Ruth has written a book called Third Culture Kids, which has been a seminal work in understanding the effects of these sorts of childhoods on human beings. Personality characteristics that I just thought were me were shown to be the result of family disruption, social instability, cultural confusion and displacement. The ability to bury emotions, repression of memory, social strategies for frequent changes of social groups, such as the chameleon strategy, of cutting off pain, of being a poor goodbye person, of being a watcher, of seeking love and approval, the need to stay in control. They weren't so good. On the other hand, we were a group in caring professions, confident travellers, and we had wide world views. Next slide, please. I come now to a key moment in this story. On the fourth day of the conference, we walked over the hill to the site of the original school where I'd done my running away event. And as we came down from the hill, we were helping each other down. Wendy saw that and turned it into a painting. Quite symbolic. But as I came down from that hill and looked across the road, it wasn't a stream, looked across the road, I saw the gates. The memories of sitting there curled up 55 years before just overcame me. burst out into those tears that just went on and on and on. I don't think Wendy knew what was happening. I didn't think I knew what was happening either. So when we returned to Brisbane, I set out to try and work out what had happened. What was that all about? I signed up for counselling, attended several more of these school reunions over the next 5 years, did a lot of reading and reflecting, and the process has been described as being like peeling an onion, taking it off layer by layer, and it was like that for me. The counsellor I saw first identified that I did have a locked compartment inside of which all of my sadness had been sort of poured away and gradually built up. Until, like a bucket full to the brim, how's that bucket going here? And like a bucket full to the brim, it only took one more drop of sadness to make it overflow. So I set out to release the sadness. Old hymns were my best way. We started off with some old hymns, and that was one of them. Those were one of them. I used to have a clinic out at North Lakes, and I'd drive out there, and I'd set the car stereo on playing hymns, and I'd drive out, and I'd be crying. There was such a sense of loss. They had been so precious, and yet now I wasn't too sure what they really meant. But it worked. When I went to Chifu the next time, I made sure there was no one around. When I snuck around to those old gates, and I was fine, they'd lost their power to hurt. That was healed. Gradually, I discovered that not only was their memories locked away, but inside that locked compartment there was a small bereft boy, 6 years old, thin and almost translucent, a body memory. Slowly I then realised that the medical me was a mask which I had carefully and unknowingly constructed to be pleasing, effective and convincing. That boy needed deliverance. And so what I used to do was I'd try and work on taking the medical mask off on weekends, often with crying. But then on Monday I'd have to put it back on again, go back to work. So eventually the pressure of this yin and yang became too much for me. I was also running a unit, and it was a lot of work. And so in December 2017 I retired. Not because I was too old, not because I was sick of medicine, but because I needed to sort this out. And the hardest work then lay ahead. Next slide, please. My parents were very clear. I was sent to Chifu because God demanded it and he had promised to protect us. But when I met Chifu alumni en masse, it became very apparent that not only I had been damaged, we all had to some degree or other. One counsellor at that first conference said it was carnage. Broken lives, relationships, families, chronic ill health, psychological problems, many with lost or no faith. We remembered 23 deaths at that first conference from trauma, accidents, suicides, drug overdoses, malaria and cancer. And then boys in one dorm were found to have been sexually abused by one of the carers. 2 of those boys had committed suicide as adults. One had been taking medications for a dissociative personality disorder, to which he had a reaction which damaged his brain, and he spent the rest of his life, and still is, in an institution in the US. Of the 2 survivors, one was there, and he had kept it totally quiet to himself throughout his life. But he elected at that time to open it up subsequent OMF investigation took place, and they came to the conclusion that it was absolutely true. But because there were so many jurisdictions involved, there was no way to catch up with the perpetrator. I wasn't abused, but hearing stories about abuse really got to me. The Institutional Commission of Sexual Abuse, I found really difficult. And so much I started to think, have I got another buried memory? Is something bad happened? But no. I just knew that we kids were all so vulnerable. Kids need parents for protection. Silly thing maybe, but I've got type 1 diabetes. It's an autoimmune disease. Autoimmune diseases are increased in kids with childhood trauma. I discovered that out of the 300 people involved in the cohort that we're talking about today, there were 3 of us who were diabetic, type 1 diabetics. And the overall incidence in Australia is 12 per 100,000. Don't know. I had to conclude that God did not protect us from harm. Now, no one can see from God's perspective, but 60 years of living kind of gives you a little bit of perspective. God hadn't protected us. Saying that even today hurts, because behind that statement are a heap of consequences. I cannot believe that God intended children to be hurt. Jesus' words on that are very clear. So our parents were wrong to send us away and break up our families in God's name. Where had things gone wrong? Next slide, please. Is God not the reliable promise keeper whom we think? Is there a God at all? Were my parents caught in a church and missionary system that somehow was in error? Do we say things about God that we ourselves have made up? So what is right and true, and what is made up? And how do you tell the difference? Have our concepts of God drifted from his reality and fallen into a culture or pattern of belief that led to the sacrifice of children? I think certainly an evangelical culture had developed that led directly to sending children as sacrifices. And in the Old Testament, that was called the abomination of Moloch, for those of you that really know your Old Testament. Dealing with this mess was awful. My whole life story was unravelled and was a shambles. I had believed and was complicit in a story about my boarding, a construct that was not true, and I had collaborated in hiding truth from myself. How could I trust myself again? I wrote a poem about being lost at sea, limitless dark depths under my flailing feet. Now, even if God was not bound by the promises we say he has given, surely he could have looked after us, we children who had been given so trustfully and worshipfully to his work. In 2018, I had become angry with such a God and eventually concluded that he was just not there. The whole faith story was made from our human need for meaning, purpose, and security. That was the darkest place I've ever been. Next slide. In September 2018, I returned to Chifu, Malaysia, for the third conference. Ulrika Ernvik was again the speaker, and she talked about the way trauma affects children. In the book that we printed, I have fuller notes on what she said, but in essence, a couple of quotes will do. Children need to be seen with glad eyes, to breathe with someone, to deal with emotions with someone, to get needs met, to get a sense of value and love, and to feel a sense of significance. Another quote. When children feel lonely, scared and helpless, we first look for safety. Is there a safe person? Without a safe haven, children are easily traumatized. And finally, to heal the trauma, we need to go back to the traumatic event memory and bring in safety by inviting someone, something safe into that memory. Now, stay with me here because the story does get a little weird. I asked Ulrika to use her technique on me. We had a one-on-one session. Of course, the memory for me was that one of running away and freezing by the school gate. I told Ulrika I couldn't think of anyone safe to take into that story. My parents had deliberately sent me. And who knew about God? Ulrika was undisturbed. She said, let's just go there and see who comes. So I told the story to her, and she asked me to concentrate on the physical feelings, because this was a body memory, not a cortical memory, not a brain memory up here. So it was deeply embedded into me. And so I told the story and felt the crunch of the gravel, felt the cold of the air, felt the despair. And so we waited together, squatted down beside the gate in the memory. And then, to my immense surprise, my mother came round the corner and cuddled me and said she did not know how much this was hurting me. She'd take me back to Thailand, where we all held a family conference and decided to go home to Australia. Even as I say that, I feel teary. I was a mess that day. But that was the most amazing release for me. My anger against God disappeared by the time I walked out of the room. I just needed my mum and her love. The 6-year-old needed to know that I was loved, though the sending away had given a hidden message that the work, God, and the mission all came before me in importance. That I was not loved enough to care. Now that trauma has been structural for me. It was buried deeply because the fear of not being worth love too much to even look at, and I buried it. My faith, my work, my life story all helped cover over that deep hidden pain. Now it was opened and drained, and the relief has been huge. And that was a healing for me that stood strong even until today. I know my parents love me. I know God loves me. And I think this whole journey is God reaching out to heal his scarred kids. So, next slide, please. Let's circle back to Hudson Taylor. Unless I'm blinded, it seems to me that the forces that led to our damaged Chifu were similar to the forces that led to the sacrifice of mission children in the Boxer Rebellion. Then, as now, men and women of immense courage, faith and relationship with God ended up getting into a situation from which children were damaged. So why did our parents send us away? Next slide, please. Certainly the attitude of children was different back then. Yes, there was a strong British imperial culture for sending children of the empire to boarding schools. Yeah, that was a factor. Yet, if this family breakup of the keenest Christians was what God wanted, he knows the end from the beginning. So he knew that children would be damaged by this sending, just as you would be damaged if you jumped off a cliff. Consequences happen in God's will. I couldn't accept that the error was God's. Next slide. A friend commented something to me that really resonated. He said, "It only takes an error of 1%, which goes for centuries, and the distance from the road marked right becomes a long way off the right road." And it seems to me that there are some parts of our system of belief, both in the 19th and the 20th centuries, that has gone astray. Now, once that possibility is admitted, then nearly everything is up for thinking about, for review. Is the Bible and the way we interpret it, is that God's way, or is that our human way? That's just one question. I focused this year on the place of sacrifice in Christian living. My parents gave me up, or sacrificed me, for the work of God. I was an Isaac on the altar. Have we interpreted that story correctly? I now read it as God teaching Abraham that although in surrounding cultures child sacrifice was frequently used as a way of making a God love you, that he didn't want it, and that he would provide a scapegoat. Kind of changes the emphasis, doesn't it? But that then leads me straight into the work of Jesus at Calvary. Now, I'm not a theologian. Don't start throwing things at me, because I'm on sacred ground here. But our Christian culture has made Christ's death, the story of a father who sends his son to be tortured to death on behalf of us as individuals, in order that the Father, who cannot look on sin, can allow us to approach him, because the payment has been paid for our debt of sin. Now, that theory was developed by Anselm in the 11th century. Is that totally correct? Look, I'm not providing suggestions on theology here, merely asking a question that my prism opens up. Something else that has struck me as I've looked at the concept of sacrifice is how much sacrifice was used right throughout human life, human history. It's not a Christian thing, it's a human thing. I heard these words at church, and I've seized on them because it fitted in so well. God is not a violent, death-centric God, but a loving God. We see in the great self-giving act of Christ's death an act not for God's sake, but for ours. Do you get that? I don't think there's a justification there for child sacrifice. There is if God the Father sends his Son. But if the Son chooses. Next slide, please. Another thing. Parenting is a serious responsibility. I don't think children really belong to their parents, but are placed into families who act as trustees for their early years until they come into full life themselves. Giving up children to God is not what God wants. You can sacrifice yourself if you want to. You can't sacrifice someone else. Missionaries, beware. Thank you for listening and deeply considering. There is power in story. There is also nakedness and shame. But I believe these stories need to be heard. The systems that took our most fervent believers and tricked them into sacrificing their sons and daughters is still alive and well. It may well be that God in our time is saying to his church, enough. Next slide, please. Don't get excited, Paul. Still got just a couple more. We ex-missionary kids who went to Chief conferences in 14, 16 and 2018 have stayed in contact, and we just felt that maybe the church needed to hear what we had found out. And so a group of us got together and we formed a committee that wrote to all of the kids and said, look, can you just give us an idea as to how your life has gone, bearing in mind you attended a mission boarding school from the age of whatever. Now I think I heard that your book that's being published from here has got 20 authors. 42. We've got 42. Each of us is an individual, each of us is different. And yet, what we wanted the readers to be able to do is to use your own brain and see where the common pathways and the common influences are. And they're certainly there to be seen. It's not an easy read, but it's one you won't regret. Anyway, I have some copies here today, but if you wish to buy one, or you can order them through various Amazon, or there's stuff up there, that's all right. Now, I'm just going to finish with a reading from the book, because one of the things we had Paul Young come as the speaker at one of the conferences, and Paul Young wrote The Shack. Now, some of you have not him. Paul Young was a sexually abused boarding school missionary's kid. So he was right speaking our language. And he wrote our foreword when I wrote to him and said, Paul, would you mind writing a foreword for us? And he wrote something which is, I think, intensely helpful. Can we have the next slide, please? Oh no, there it is. Did our parents intend to harm us? Did they understand how the turning of their faces away from their children was not an act of God or godliness? Did the mission comprehend the damage their mandates would affect as they rippled through the tender hearts of children? Was this God's will, the cost of doing evangelizing? No, 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 and no. What seems a small price to pay to an adult thinking God thoughts is undeniably costly to the little ones named small price. And yet, the redeeming genius crawled inside all these mixed motives and intentions, both the darkness and the light, and blessed with life, anything that was still of love's kind. And now continues to work within the ripples to redeem everything. Because of the sacrifices made, many did hear about a love named Jesus. There is no justification, however, for a cross or the sacrifice of children. There is, however, redemption. Thank you for listening carefully. Thank you, Wendy, for allowing me to use your wonderful art. And thank you all for listening.